Hey there, Academy members. In this video, I want to talk about a pretty hot topic in the homebrewing world, and that's whether or not to use a secondary fermenter. So I have this batch of beer. It's been in the primary for 7 days, and conventional homebrewing wisdom tells me that I should transfer it to a secondary. And even today, that's really what most homebrewers do. They don't even question it. You do a primary and then a secondary. But recently, there's been a shift in the homebrewing world, and I agree with it. It's that you should do instead an extended primary and no secondary at all. So in this video, I'll state my case and you can decide whether or not you agree with me. All right, now let's talk about why this theory for a secondary is even out there. But first I want to address the term secondary fermentation, because that's really a misnomer. When you transfer the beer, there's not a new or secondary fermentation taking place. It's the same fermentation, so we really shouldn't be using that term. But you really shouldn't even transfer the beer during fermentation anyways. You should always let that finish in the primary. Just let the yeast do their job and leave them alone. But assuming you do that, then do you transfer to a secondary? That's the big question. And a main argument by homebrewers for it is for clearer beer. They want to have crystal clear beer. But myself and tons of other homebrewers can tell you from experience that we get really clear beer by doing an extended primary and no secondary. The reason is, when you leave it in the primary for a long time, you get this really compact, dense layer of yeast and trub on the bottom. And then when you go to transfer the beer, you just stop siphoning before you get to that layer, and that stays behind. Even if some gets over to the bottling bucket, that'll drop out and you can leave it behind in the bucket. Or if some gets over to the bottles, when you chill the bottles down, that trub will drop out and you just leave that behind when you pour out the bottles. So the whole clarity issue in that argument doesn't really stand up. Another argument for the secondary has been that you need to get the beer off the yeast because otherwise you're going to get off flavors, and autolysis is the common one that's thrown out there. And that was true 10 years ago when the only yeast available to homebrewers was really low quality, weak yeast that would die off easily in the beer. But that's not true nowadays. Now we have access to really high quality yeast, the same stuff the pros use. We're making yeast starters, it's healthier, and you can leave the beer on the yeast for an extended period of time. I've gone a month or more, and other homebrewers have gone much longer than that. And it's actually good for the beer. Even after fermentation is done, you want to leave it on the yeast because the yeast is going to clean up some off flavors and give you a cleaner, more polished beer. So that argument doesn't really hold up anymore either. In addition to those things, there are also some risks associated with transferring to a secondary. Whenever you do that, no matter how good you are at siphoning, you're going to pick up some oxygen, and that's going to affect the stability of your beer. It's going to have a shorter shelf life, and it can give you some oxidized flavors as well. Also, whenever you transfer it, whenever you open up your beer and you handle it, it puts it at risk for contamination. So when you transfer to a secondary, there's always a greater risk that you're going to infect your beer. So what do? I do an extended primary for 2 to 4 weeks. 2 weeks is a minimum. Even if fermentation is done, I want to keep the beer on the yeast so the yeast can clean up those off flavors. And I know it seems like I'm all against secondaries, but I actually do use them sometimes. If I'm doing something special like adding fruit or oak chips or dry hopping, then I'll use a secondary. Or if I'm aging a beer for a few months, a big beer, or if I'm lagering, then I'll transfer it from the primary. But what I recommend to brewers, and especially new brewers, is as your default method, do an extended primary and no secondary. Then later on, once you get some batches under your belt, decide if you want to add a secondary and see how that works for you. Some homebrewers swear by it. It's not my preferred method, but of course your mileage may vary. So hope that helps.